Welcome to this discussion of metaphysics. In particular, I want to discuss an interesting question of skepticism. Those philosophers who are skeptical about metaphysics, what did they have to say and what was their justification for their view? Now, the first thing to say is that there were, in modern times, three very significant philosophers who did express a skeptical view about philosophy in general, but about metaphysics in particular. These were, in the 18th century, these were David Hume, here. Then in the 20th century, we have those which, to some extent, borrowed from Hume, and they were the logical positivists. In between those two, in between Hume and the positivists, we have a figure who's not associated really with either of those, and that is Friedrich Nietzsche. The ideas that lie behind them are very similar. Why? Well, it was because in many respects they owe their skepticism to an original skepticism that was present in early-ish Roman times, 2nd century AD. And that was a philosopher by the name of Sextus Empiricus. Sextus Empiricus in the 2nd century AD. He was taken to be a follower, a disciple of another earlier philosopher, roughly slightly later, perhaps a generation later than Plato, whose name was Pyrrho. And Pyrrho was then taken up by Sextus Empiricus. Pyrrho wrote nothing down, common complaint. Sextus Empiricus did, and Sextus Empiricus's work has come down to us. And it was translated into Latin in sufficient time for Hume to become aware of it in the 18th century. Hume then had an enormous influence on Kant, and so one gets this assimilated also into Kant, who tries in ways to get around some of the skeptical answers that Hume gives and to give a non-skeptical solution, with what degree of satisfaction is debated. In between Hume and the empiricists, the logical empiricists, logical positivists, we have Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche knew about Greek philosophy. It was his subject. It's often thought that he only knew a great deal about ancient Greek philosophy, which was really his thing. But he also knew about a Roman writer by the name of Diogenes Laertius, who gives us a lot of information about the early philosophers, not all of it reliable, much of it is not. But Diogenes Laertius wrote a set of volumes called Lives of the Philosophers, and one of the philosophers that he discusses most is Sextus Empiricus. So we know a fair amount of what Sextus Empiricus said, also from Diogenes Laertius. Now, the important thing is that Nietzsche knew the work of Diogenes Laertius, and he knew, to some extent, the work of Sextus Empiricus, because he wrote a thesis on Diogenes Laertius. This was one of his main interests in the Roman period of early philosophy was, to some extent, sorting out what Diogenes Laertius was saying, and then, of course, that involves having some idea and interest in what was going on in the views of Sextus Empiricus. So it's there as an influence on Nietzsche, but it's a very difficult influence to discern, because in his published works, Nietzsche does not say much of anything at all about Sextus Empiricus. So if you were just to read the books, you would not get much of a sense of there being any direct line of descent from Sextus Empiricus to Nietzsche. But that is not the whole of the story. There were, in Nietzsche's own notes, because he wrote notes for his own thesis on Diogenes Laertius, there were comments about this which show that he was aware of it and that he knew it. He was also aware of Hume and discusses Hume at one point in one of his books. So we have this idea that Sextus Empiricus was a direct antecedent for skepticism for Hume, Nietzsche, and the logical positivists. Now, that skepticism comes forth most clearly in Nietzsche's last major work, which is on metaphysical topics. Many of his later works do not reveal this, but the work called Twilight of the Idols does. It is a work to a great extent in metaphysics. It discusses other things as well, but you get Nietzsche's metaphysical statements as he last formulated them in this book, Twilight of the Idols. What then are Nietzsche's last metaphysical views? It's an interesting question and an important one, because it's completely at variance to what most people think Nietzsche believed. Let's take a couple of those things that he is supposed to have had dear to his heart as metaphysical theses. The first one is the idea that Nietzsche, and this is the most common thing that is supposed about Nietzsche, is that Nietzsche was really an originator, a forceful advocate for atheism. That Nietzsche had declared, as he had done, God is dead. He did so in The Gay Science, and he repeats it in Zarathustra, which comes afterward. So, God is dead. What does he mean by that? Well, it sounds as clear as day, and it sounds like as clear a statement of atheism as one could get. There is no God, God is dead. But that isn't really what Nietzsche means in that, despite it being what he says. He makes it clear in the other late work that is often paired together with Twilight of the Idols, the volume that is called The Antichrist. He makes it clear that what he means by that is that the Christian God doesn't exist. Or he doesn't even quite say that. Here is what he does say. I'll just read it to you. What sets us apart is not that we recognize no God, either in history or in nature or behind nature, but that we find that which has been reverenced as God, not godlike, but pitiable, absurd, harmful, not merely an error, but a crime against life. We deny God as God. If this God of the Christians were ever proved to us to exist, we should know even less how to believe in him. That is Nietzsche's final statement in the Antichrist as to what he means by the death of God. He means, as he makes clear, that he denies the God-likeness of the Christian God. That is what he was saying. And that is what he was saying earlier as well. Now he repeats this in another late work called Ecce Homo. And Ecce Homo is sometimes ridiculed because of its sort of grandiose tone, but throughout of it you can take that as mostly a comic tone, and what Nietzsche says is perfectly reasonable and often straightforward. What he says in Ecce Homo is, I'll just read it to you. What he says is, I do not by any means know atheism as a result, even less as an event. It is a matter of course with me from instinct. I am too inquisitive, too questionable, too exuberant to stand for any gross answer. God is a gross answer, an indelicacy against us thinkers, at bottom merely a gross prohibition for us. You shall not think. Now, that sounds stronger, but that is partly because it is translated, and this is the translation here, it is translated by Walter Kaufmann. Now, Walter Kaufmann was absolutely committed to the public presentation of Nietzsche as an atheist, as the first atheist voice. Walter Kaufmann wants to endorse that atheism. He wants that atheism to be his view. And what he does frequently is to strengthen what Nietzsche says into something which he is not saying. So when Nietzsche says he does not take atheism as a result, what he was saying was that atheism is a declarative conclusion. It says there is no God. We can prove that there is no God. That's not Nietzsche's view. Nietzsche's view is as the quotation from the Antichrist makes clear, is that what that God can be is not the Christian God, which cannot be reverenced by us as God, sufficiently godlike, which is what he says. So when he says that there is no, that atheism is not the result of his thinking, what he means by that is that he's not for a declaration of atheism. Rather, his view is a withholding of judgment on the issue of whether there could be a God behind nature. That's his view, and that's an agnostic view. So his view was strictly an agnosticism, expressed seemingly very strongly earlier on, but that is not his position. So that view, God is dead, is not really an expression of Nietzsche's atheism. It's an expression of his dissatisfaction with the Christian idea of God, combined with a sort of an agnostic view in general, a non-declarative view about, well, there isn't enough evidence for us to draw the conclusion that there is a God in nature. That's his view. That's one view. The second view I want to say is not Nietzsche's view, is one that has been very heavily promoted as Nietzsche's view, and it's still very heavily promoted, and it's the view that Nietzsche holds that there is a will to power. That's the name given to one of the last of Nietzsche's books, published after, not by him, but after he had summarized his philosophy in his last works. And The Will to Power was put together by Nietzsche's sister while Nietzsche was pretty much in a will-less state of his last terrible illness, the illness that killed him. Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth put together from his notebooks a selection, or she had an editor do so, put together a selection of quotations from his notebooks that Nietzsche had not published, and put this book, as a large book, The Will to Power, as Nietzsche's last work. This was a travesty, and it has completely shifted our understanding of Nietzsche, because it seems to many people to be a final work. It's not. It was never authorized by Nietzsche, and it misrepresents Nietzsche's thought significantly. So he does, at various times, speak of the will to power in his, what we could call his middle period. But when we come to his final metaphysical views being expressed, the will to power is not mentioned in the Twilight of the Idols. It's mentioned once. So what we get in Twilight of the Idols is something completely different, and something that negates all of that. That there is no will at all. That the will is a mistake. So there is no will to power in Nietzsche's last metaphysics. All will has been gotten rid of. It's a mistake, and it's a mistake that occurs along with other mistakes. Nietzsche does not believe that there is any kind of will to power in us. Can't be said strongly enough, because it goes against so much of what you will hear in coffee room conversations about what Nietzsche thought. He does not think, finally, that there is such a thing as will to power. He thinks there is no will at all. He thinks the idea of a will is a mistake. Here is what he says on the subject. The whole of the old-style psychology of will has as its precondition the desire of its authors, the priests at the head of the ancient communities, to create for themselves a right to ordain punishments, or their desire to create for God a right to do so. Men were thought of as free so that they could become guilty. Consequently, every action had to be thought of as willed. The origin of every action as lying in the consciousness, whereby the most fundamental falsification in psychologists was made into the very principle of psychology. So the concept of will is an invention imposed upon human beings in order to make us responsible for our actions. We have willed them, therefore we are guilty of them, therefore we are responsible for them, and we can be punished for them. That is his idea. But he doesn't leave it there. He has a more elaborate statement of this, and here it is. This is two quotes, also from Twilight of the Idols. It is this which sees everywhere deed and doer, this which believes in will as cause in general, this which believes in the I, the ego in other words, the I, into the I as being, in the I as substance, and which projects its belief in the I substance onto all things. Only thus does it create the concept thing. Being is everywhere thought in, foisted on as cause. It is only from the concept I that there follows, derivatively, the concept being. At the beginning stands the great fateful error that the will is something which produces an effect, that will is a faculty. Today we know it is merely a word. That was from Twilight of the Idols, Reason in Philosophy. Here is the second quote. This is from The Four Great Errors, section 3. And this is the broader point that Nietzsche is making. The inner world is full of phantoms and false lights. The will is one of them. The will no longer moves anything, consequently no longer explains anything. It merely accompanies events. It can also be absent. The so-called motive, another error, merely a surface phenomenon of consciousness, an accompaniment to an act, which conceals rather than exposes the antecedentia of the act. And as for the ego, it has become a fable, a fiction, a play on words. It has totally ceased to think, to feel, and to will. Well, this could not really be any clearer. The will is a chimera. It is a thing which we have invented and projected, as it were, onto ourselves. We think of ourselves as willing certain things, and that willing separates us from the world. The world becomes something else on which we impose our will. We kill a lion, we do this, we do that. We hide from the lions. Our will constructs our world as a world in which we are beings. Our beings are creating ourselves as the things which give rise to that will, and it also gives rise to a world on which that will exerts itself. Now, that exerting itself onto the world creates the idea of that world as something separate. So we get the idea of punishment. This idea seems to come from the idea that there is a priesthood, as he says earlier, that there is a priesthood that wants us to be guilty of various things. Here the idea is a more primeval idea. You may say it's a contradiction, and it is. There's a more primeval idea that the will is something which has been invented in order to separate us off from the world and create a world of beings which are separate from us and in which we do things too. That this is a world of, as it were, of things which have some significance for us. We separate off the lion from the foliage in which it's hiding. We separate off the bear from the cave in which it's sleeping, etc., etc. We make distinctions between things in the world. In other words, we create an ontology which goes along with our acting upon things. So there are no things here. Things become an imposition by us on the world of our experience. Our experience, well, that's another problem for Nietzsche. Now, and when all of this happens, this will is somehow an imposition that creates this world. That's the idea. Now, I'm not endorsing this view at all. I don't endorse it. I'm merely saying This is Nietzsche's final view. To be clear, what he's saying is something like this. When we think of a metaphysics, we think of a world of things and a world of relations between those things, which we call causal relations. He wants to deny those causal relations. The will is an aspect of the causal structure of the world, of how we act upon the world. We make decisions, and those decisions are carried out by acts of will. He wants to deny all of that. He wants to say, no, all of this is an illusion. That illusion is creating a world of beings which are, in some sense, merely functional. We distinguish the lion as something distinct from the underbrush. And our doing that has made us believe in a world of separate items moving about in their own way. That is Nietzsche's anti-metaphysical position. You may immediately say that's really implausible, but that's his view. He wants to deny a world of beings, and us as beings. The I, the idea of myself as a thing that wills, he wants to say that's an illusion created by the original illusion, which is the idea of a will. But he has more to say on this. His final view is what you could say is a kind of holism. He attaches this to some extent to his favorite philosopher, Heraclitus. Everything is moving, everything is changing, therefore static being can't exist. The lion is not something which exists as a thing, as the form of something, which is the form of a lion. There is no such beast. There is something only in change, only in flux, only as it's changing. And here's what he says on that. Today, on the contrary, we see ourselves, as it were, entangled in error, necessitated to error, to precisely the extent that our prejudice in favour of reason compels us to posit unity, identity, duration, substance, cause, objectivity, being. However sure we may be, on the basis of strict reasoning, that error is to be found here. The situation is the same as with the motions of the sun. In that case, error has our eyes. In the present case, our language as a perpetual advocate. Language belongs in its origin to the age of the most rudimentary form of psychology. We find ourselves in the midst of a rude fetishism when we call to mind the basic presuppositions of the proposition metaphysics. That's a hyphenated thing, proposition metaphysics, that's what he means. Which is to say, of reason. It is this which sees everywhere deed and doer, that which believes in will as cause in general, this which believes in the I as being, in the I as substance, and which projects its belief in the I substance onto all things. Only thus does it create the concept thing. Note that here we have no longer an expression of an agnosticism. This is a declaration of what Nietzsche takes to be the case. So he is saying, it doesn't offer any proof, but he is saying this is what the world is like. It simply does not have these things as a part of it. There is no such ontology. He says one is necessary, meaning himself. One is necessary. One is a piece of fate. one belongs to the whole. One is part of the whole. There exists nothing which could judge, measure, compare, condemn our being, for that would be to judge, measure, compare, condemn the whole. But nothing exists apart from the whole. That no one is any longer made accountable, that the kind of being manifested cannot be traced back to a causa prima, first cause, that the world is a unity, neither as sensorium nor as spirit. This alone is the great liberation. Thus alone is the innocence of becoming restored. The concept of God has hitherto been the greatest objection to existence. We deny God. In denying God, we deny accountability. Only by doing so do we redeem the world. Again, this is no agnosticism. This is Nietzsche declaring what he thinks. This holism is his view. It's a surprising view because I don't know that it's ever been attributed to Nietzsche, but it is what he says and it is what he believes, I think, from what we can see here. Where does it come from? For Nietzsche, anyway. Where does it come from? Well, the answer is, it seems, it comes from Heraclitus, because we have this in Heraclitus. Heraclitus is not just simply an espouser of flux. He is also an espouser of a holism. Here is what he says. For those who have heard not me but the Logos, wisdom is agreeing that all things are one. For those who have heard not me but the Logos, wisdom is agreeing that all things are one. That's Heraclitus. And that, in the end, is Nietzsche's view. It may be unsatisfactory. You can decide for yourself. But that is his view. There is no will. There are no things. There is no I. All of these things are an isolation of things out of the flux, out of being, out of that holism. That holism, as it were, doesn't have markers to distinguish the lion from the sky in which it's set. They're all, in some sense, the same. That holism is, you might say, it has an almost oriental feel to it. And to many it does. It has a distinctly Buddhist sound to it. And I don't think Nietzsche would entirely mind that. So that is his view. As a final point, I will say something that against the Superman. Just as Nietzsche designed, I mean, in this sense, is an obvious corollary of what we've had just now. This idea of the Superman as whatever it is Nietzsche conceives of the Superman as a being that makes up its own values or something of that kind, that idea also doesn't occur really in the Twilight of the Idols. It's gone. And the Superman appears just once again, mentioned just once. That's it. Nietzsche's view seems to be that, well, in stating what he thinks about being as a whole, we have done away with that. The thing that sits behind almost all of this is another large thesis of Nietzsche's that denies what one could call a two-worldsism. Two-worldsism is the idea which one finds in many philosophers. He thinks of it as a Platonic idea initially, that there is a world of things and then there is something above it called a world of forms, another world. That idea is an idea which I've said Plato denies, but Certainly Nietzsche thinks of that as, it's a received view of Plato, and Nietzsche does not go beyond it. So Nietzsche's idea is that, well, there is this two worldsism. We get it in Plato. We get it even in Parmenides, in fact. But we get it in Plato. From Plato, it seems to get absorbed into Christianity. So in Christianity, you have a kind of two worldsism, a world of this world, and then a world of heaven. That world, you could say, well, there's also hell, but in some ways, in the sort of beginnings of classical Christianity, what you're getting is really a Platonic two worldsism, which has become sort of the domain of God, the domain of the good, the domain of the infinite, as it were, and that is distinct from the fallen world, which is how St. Augustine thinks of world below, our world, the world of our senses. It's a fallen world as opposed to the world of God. So that's a two worldsism too. And then we get what comes for Nietzsche as the final version of two worldsism, a version which he really hates. And that is the version in Kant. Kant's phenomenal world and noumenal world. That is one of the things which he is most opposed to. And in The Twilight of the Idols, we get it continually argued against. This is expressed in The Antichrist again. And anyone who wants to interpret Nietzsche in a sort of Germanic tradition as being a Kantian or as having any sympathy at all with that sort of tradition with Kant, you just need to hang on to this statement and understand it. Why the rejoicing heard throughout the German academic world, 3/4 composed of the sons of pastors, meaning clergymen, and schoolmasters, at the appearance of Kant? Why the Germans' conviction, which still finds an echo even today, that with Kant things were taking a turn for the better? The theologian instinct in the German scholar divined what was henceforth possible once again. A back staircase to the old ideal stood revealed, the concept true world. The concept of morality as the essence of the world. These two most vicious errors in existence were once more, thanks to a crafty, sly skepticism, if not demonstrable, yet no longer refutable. Reason, the prerogative of reason, does not extend so far. One had made reality into an appearance. One had made a completely false world of beings into a reality that would be the noumenal world. Kant's success was merely a theologian's success. German integrity was far from firm, and Kant, like Luther, like Leibniz, was one more load upon it. It could not be more clear, unless we have this little bit from Twilight of the Idols, to divide the world into a real and an apparent world, that is the nominal versus the phenomenal world, whether in the manner of Christianity or in the manner of Kant, which is, after all, merely that of a cunning Christian, is only a manifestation of decadence, a symptom of declining life. That is Nietzsche's view. I hope it's clear now that much of what is said about, well, that is sort of quoted or said to be Nietzsche's view, certainly one can find things expressed at various times and places in Nietzsche. Nietzsche is continually rethinking his ideas with every book, really. But his final view, was that that is all nonsense. The final view is there may be a God, we don't know, maybe. He's not going to pin his hopes on anything of such kind, but there may be. And secondly, there is no will to power. There is no will. Thirdly, there is no world of beings that can be taken away from, which is a sort of, which have sort of forms, a sort of a permanency and an identity within the world of our experience. To think that there is all a mistake. And similarly, the Superman as something which is capable of transcending all of that world, all of that is a mistake too. Well, he doesn't quite say that, but he doesn't elaborate on it either in the final work. There's nothing which spells out for us what the Superman could be. There doesn't seem to be any role for it anymore. So that's really what I think his view is. So this is, as it were, a way of putting a little bit of reality back into the discussion of Nietzsche, which is way out of control in many instances. Things are said in undergraduate talks by people who have very little interest in what Nietzsche actually says and are merely quoting what he is said to have said, are continually imposing upon him ideas that he just, in the long run, doesn't hold. That makes his view interesting, controversial. I think it doesn't make it true. I think his view, ultimately, it's an interesting anti-metaphysical view. It's a view that would come from Sextus Empiricus. But it certainly is not a view in which his own earlier metaphysics would be able to, as it were, shine through into to give us, as it were, an alternative world of selfhood and of will to power and of Superman as a superego. All of that seems to be lost. Thank you, and till next time.